The fact that we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons at all is a testament to the uniqueness of it, an entirely new type of game in an already small game industry. What would allow it to go from the fringe to the mainstream was an opportune time. The same reason that Star Wars was giving something people didn't realize they were missing, D&D was doing the same. The blessing and curse of it, though, was the nature of this attention. The game would become known thanks to those who wished to see it stamped out. Even though the Great War between Gygax and Arneson was not over, this national narrative would hang like a shadow over it during the age of Clerics. Before we delve into this part, I want to emphasize that I want to be fair in this recounting. Even with both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson passed on, conflicts over their legacies remain. This accounting is going to paint Gygax in a more negative light, simply because he didn't acquit himself in a positive one. Lest you think I'm going to gloss over Arneson's behavior, I'll agree, he made some bad choices. He was winning the battle of public opinion, but he crossed the line at the 1978 Origins Convention in the minds of the gaming community, when the first H.G. Wells Awards were being given out for achievements in miniatures. Previously, with Origins' emphasis on board wargaming, thanks to Avalon Hill and SPI, the Charles S. Roberts Awards were given out. So this covered both sides of the industry, miniatures and board gaming. Because D&D was birthed from miniatures and RPGs were an entirely new kind of gaming, it was included in this category and won 3 awards that day. But for the third, for the rules system, Arneson ran to the podium before TSR could get up there and claim the award. He argued, not unreasonably, that when Star Wars wins an Oscar, the award doesn't go to 20th Century Fox. It goes to the ones who actually did that job. But the sentiment was, by and large, that Arneson's behavior and later refusal to return the award, in fact he demanded plaques of the other 2 as well, cost him a bit of currency and goodwill. I should also add that Arneson showed sour grapes over AD&D, on the one hand dismissing it and even commenting, "Hardcover, whoopee!" despite it being universally agreed to be the most beautiful product of its kind ever made. In secret, he lamented not being tapped in any way for it, and even listed it on his CV as a product that he was responsible for the same reason that he was suing for royalties, that it is merely an updating of his game. His work with other game companies also ran into problems at times, some beyond his control and some that weren't. We should keep in mind the point I've been repeating. Gary Gygax knew how to turn this game into a working product that people wanted to play, and that's not nothing. While his attempts to write Arneson out of the picture were grossly unfair, the court of public opinion of the time that went so far as to say, Dungeons and Dragons, written by Dave Arneson, edited by Gary Gygax, were simply doing the same thing in the other direction. But regardless of public relations, D&D was growing into a hit within the gaming community. But that was still the case of being a big fish in a small pond, as they would soon find out. TSR outgrew the house on William Street and took over the Hotel Claire in Lake Geneva, a local fixture with a bowling alley in the basement and the ground floor lounge, now home to the Dungeon Hobby Shop and the offices of the growing staff at TSR. After the 1978 Gen Con disappointed both TSR and the vendors, to the point of creating Gamma to avoid future problems, TSR worked to make 1979's Gen Con even better. Still at Parkside's campus and advertised this time to try to appeal to a larger market, they had no idea that the greatest advertisement possible was about to hit, though admittedly not under ideal circumstances. During an interview at Gen Con, the reporter asked if TSR had anything to say about the missing boy, to which they responded, "What missing boy?" The missing boy was James Dallas Egbert III, a child prodigy who at the age of 16 was already attending college at Michigan State University. At the same time that Gen Con was starting, Egbert vanished, leaving behind a suicide note with instructions on what to do with his body. Baffled and hopeful for clues, the police learned that Egbert played a game called Dungeons and Dragons, which they had never heard of, and the other students declined to discuss it. This convinced the police at first that this was a game the students had simply invented, but they made a remark when describing it to the press. It could have been that they were describing how it was a popular but largely unknown game, or they could have taken the secrecy around the game to have their term be literal. But whatever the intention, the word they used would forever color D&D. Cult. Eventually, the police realized that the game was made by TSR and contacted them about it, asking if they could help with the pattern of pins in a bulletin board, some of which conformed to the entrances to the miles of steam tunnels under the campus. Gygax and Bloom looked over photographs of it, but if there was a pattern, even the owners of a game company couldn't find it. The police admitted they were grasping at straws. They had also taken a deck of tarot cards found at the scene to an expert to see if the order of the cards in the deck held any clues. What helped propel the narrative still further was the family's decision to hire a private investigator named William Deere. I am not going to make accusations about his character, but I will state upon hearing his behavior, it frequently reminded me of the kind of things the title character might pull on Better Call Saul. If you want to know anything more about him, just know this. He was directly involved in the alien autopsy special for Fox. He conducted a personal and much publicized search of the steam tunnels, despite the police having already done so with greater manpower and found nothing. He repeatedly flew his private plane over the campus, a feat that he added to the enormous bill he was already charging the desperate parents. In total, it came to almost $40,000. And keep in mind, this is $1979 we're talking about. When he spoke to the media about the game, he, to be blunt, spoke directly from his own asshole. You had to be invited to play the game. The pattern of pins on the board was part of the game, and experienced players would recognize the strategy that Egbert had employed. And the having no connection to reality whatsoever line, when someone's put in the dungeon, it's up to them to get out. One thing Deere was sure of was that Egbert was definitely dead. They were looking for a body. The story went national, but while the game was accused of killing a teenage prodigy, it was being mentioned in newspapers and news broadcasts across the country. And after a police captain took over the investigation to try to tamp down the media circus, he said they had seen nothing to really suggest the game had anything to do with this, and expressed fear that, if alive, the publicity would drive Egbert into hiding. Egbert, it turned out, had no idea there was a national conversation about him. He had attempted suicide, twice in fact, but in the end started working in Louisiana before finally being convinced to call his mother. Despite Deere's later assertions that drumming up publicity for the case would help, a dubious assertion given his certainty Egbert was dead, the boy had no idea that he was the subject of a national conversation. His mother had him contact Deere, who collected him and eventually delivered him to his uncle, agreeing to keep secret what happened. The story does not end happily, however. Less than a year after that, Egbert died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. TSR was thus given a monkey's paw kind of blessing. Tens of millions of people had now heard of their flagship product, and they also had it associated with cults and a missing teen. Sales on the game skyrocketed, yet the seeds had been planted that there was something fundamentally wrong with the game. 2 years later, a novel presented a fictionalized account of the Egbert tale, which was soon turned into a TV movie. The movie would never be allowed to fade from public consciousness because the Egbert-based character in it was played by an actor at the start of his career, having just completed a high-concept, low-brow sitcom where he and his friend pretended to be women to live in an all-woman building. The film was called Mazes and Monsters, and the actor was Tom Hanks, whose megastar status has ensured there would always be videotapes and DVDs of this cheap bit of hysteria showing the pseudo-D&D drive Tom Hanks to nearly throw himself off the top of the World Trade Center. But national exposure caused TSR to get a much-needed partnership with Random House. An executive's children played the game already, and seeing the game thrust onto the national stage was enough to convince that they should bring the game to the mainstream market. It wasn't just D&D, other TSR products, some not even games, were now going to mainstream stores like Kmart and Walden Books. And during the controversy, Gary Gygax used his natural charisma to become a minor celebrity as he appeared in interviews assuring people that it was a good game and not dangerous, that there was no connection between the tragic disappearance of Egbert and the game, and of course, most importantly, he was the sole creator of Dungeons & Dragons. Arneson, who used a tape recorder to record Gygax's interviews for potential use in his lawsuit over royalties, can be heard on the recording while Gygax explained about the classes. When Gygax mentioned the thief class, a bitter Arneson says, "That's you." The stakes were now heavily raised because of the skyrocketing popularity of D&D. The claim Arneson was making, that D&D was in part his intellectual property, meant not only was the AD&D game potential revenue, but theoretically the growing possibility of tie-ins as well, such as the D&D movie from 20th Century Fox, which was going to get a six-figure check for both Gygax and Brian Bloom serving as executive producers. TSR's lawyers had two options: to cut a deal with Arneson to protect the more lucrative future products, or try to screw him out of his existing contract. As you can imagine, TSR opted for the latter. To be fair, both sides had made the job harder. To paraphrase something a lawyer once told me, no lawyer has ever said, "Thank God my client spoke on the record without my consultation." Arneson, disappointed with the direction some things had gone with D&D's rules, and to illustrate his argument that Gygax had always been a control freak, had said that he actually hadn't written a word of what appeared in the manuals. This, TSR's lawyers now argued, was a confession that due to a misunderstanding on Gygax's part, Arneson should never have been considered an author on the work, and the contract derived from it null and void. However, Gygax had also commented on Arneson's role with his sleight of idea kernels. Arneson's lawyers asserted that Gygax openly admitted to the exception to the rules regarding authorship, collaboration. When two people both create a work together for the express purpose of seeing it put into publication, both are given credit, even if only one does the actual writing. TSR's lawyers tried to downplay the idea kernel's comment, but there had been numerous letters to help back it up, and what helped clinch Arneson's side was the presence of his artwork in the book, showing that he wasn't just tossing a few vague ideas out, but was working together with Gygax on creating the final product. The attempt to discredit the original contract failed, and the field of battle was now about whether Arneson could legitimately lay claim to other D&D works, and if so, what? This battle would take place, to TSR's irritation, in Minnesota and not Wisconsin. Quote, "The allegations made by plaintiff are sufficient at this pre-trial stage to create an inference that Gygax was acting both in his corporate capacity and in his individual capacity as co-author when he caused the games and game rules to be marketed in Minnesota." While TSR was distracted by the so-called Great War with Arneson, it was slowly coming under fire in the mainstream. In Heber City, Utah, there was an after-school program for gifted children to play Dungeons & Dragons. A complaint was made to try to get the game pulled, but in the end it was traced back to just two couples who felt the game was religiously offensive. No one seemed taken in by the arguments, but the decision was made that the program had served its purpose and would be dissolved at the end of the school year. Unrelated to the controversy, they insisted, but given the Egbert incident less than a year before, the news story was, "School bans Dungeons & Dragons." With the rise of the so-called Satanic panic of the 80s, D&D found itself lumped in with heavy metal music and other things that were supposed to be direct tools of Satan for corrupting the youth. A Jack Chick tract told of how the game corrupted a girl into becoming a Wiccan before she denounced the game, burned her materials, and was saved from hell, the destination of those who played D&D. The irony was that both of D&D's creators would consider themselves Christians. Arneson was, in fact, working on a game at that very time to help children learn Bible verses, and Gygax was a Jehovah's Witness whose wife Mary Jo would go door to door with pamphlets. Gygax wouldn't celebrate Christmas, feeling it wasn't a truly Christian celebration, and refused to respect the American flag because it was idol worship. His son Ernie got in trouble after hitting his teacher, but Gygax and Mary Jo took his side when they learned the teacher had struck him first, because Ernie refused to stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance, as it went against their religion. As I said, it seemed like some kind of monkey's paw was at work, having devoutly religious people too Christian for Christmas, to be tied to a game that was accused of being a tool to recruit children to the cause of Satan. D&D was now under fire with two narratives that were both false and, amusingly, completely contradictory. On one side was William Deere and Mazes and Monsters, which condemned the game because kids will mistake fantasy for reality. On the other side, religious extremists, which condemned the game because kids will mistake reality for fantasy. Some were arguing that kids would think the fictional world of swords and sorcery was the real one, and others were arguing that the real threat of Satan and the occult was being passed along to kids as a harmless fiction. TSR benefited from the fact that hating something only made their target audience like it more, but there was some strain in the Gygax household at the growing view of D&D as a tool of the devil. It made Mary Jo look guilty by association to some of their fellow Jehovah's Witnesses. The windfall sales did allow for a new lifestyle for the family, who wound up buying an estate that included horses, and the Gygaxes took to the animals so completely that they bought more and more, the home now being called Dragonland Ranch. The conflict between Arneson and TSR saw a profound shift when Arneson's team brought in an expert witness, John Freeman, who had recently completed The Complete Guide to Board Gaming. He was also behind the first D&D video game, The Temple of Apshai, which prompted Gary Gygax to comment that Freeman knew his stuff. But the conclusions that he reached would not please Gygax or TSR now. He did a breakdown of chainmail, D&D, and AD&D to show that while everything of substance in D&D had been brought into AD&D, nothing of the kind could be seen between chainmail and D&D. Gygax had argued that there was no more similarity between D&D and AD&D than there was between D&D and its many imitators. So Freeman also produced a chart comparing several other RPG character stats to show that while D&D and AD&D were identical, no one else's were identical to them. He also showed that despite Gygax's insistence that AD&D was a new game, TSR hadn't marketed it that way. AD&D was the D&D that you've been hearing about. And he noted that the first volume of AD&D, the Monster Manual, was out for a year before the Player's Handbook came out, and 2 years before the Dungeon Master's Guide. What good was a book for a game that didn't have any rules yet? But it did have rules. The Monster Manual worked just fine with the existing version of D&D. Didn't it seem silly that an entire volume of a book is 100% compatible with an entirely different game than the one that it's supposed to be? The conclusion, he said, was obvious. Even the name of it said AD&D was the same game, as they were selling it to people who wanted to play about the D&D they'd been hearing about. The plain English meaning of it was that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was a contrast to the basic Dungeons & Dragons. The lawsuit further interfered with TSR's plans. A representative from 20th Century Fox got in on the act, wondering if Arneson or anyone else might have a claim on the intellectual property that they were trying to turn into a movie. Naturally, they wanted to avoid getting dragged into this ugliness. Also, Mattel was working on a handheld electronic game, and Arneson's lawyers asked to have information on the project to determine whether or not it was infringing on his original material. And at the latest stockholder meeting, Arneson showed up with his lawyers to join in, their presence being mentioned in the internal company newsletter with the question, "Who was that fat guy with the suits?" Truthfully, this should have been Gygax's finest hour. He had invested so much into this, monetarily, emotionally, creatively, to go from a shoe cobbler to a minor public celebrity on a national level for having the hot new game that was flying off the shelves. Gygax deserved a chance to rest on his laurels and bask in his success. It is thus tragic that TSR Gary had insisted on crapping all over that with his petty dictatorial behavior, creating an enemy who was winning in both the court of public opinion and the actual courts themselves, and screwing with the company's finances. TSR should have been laser-focused on both getting its product to market and combating Mazes and Monsters-style misinformation and the negative religious campaigns against the game. But TSR efforts were compromised with time, money, and the personal time of its executives and key personnel traveling all the way to Minnesota to fight what in the end was the fallout of Gygax's personal feud. Trying to extort Arneson's work from him, demeaning him with a fig-leaf demotion to the mailroom, blocking him from the unemployment that a now unemployed person depends upon, and diminishing or excluding Arneson's contribution at every possible opportunity, TSR Gary had wielded every last bit of power at his disposal to hurt Arneson at every possible opportunity. And TSR saw they now had an enemy prepared to retaliate precisely in kind. No stone was being left unturned in Arneson's legal assault against TSR. It may be a coincidence, but at the same time, Gygax felt that he lacked the ability to do any creating anymore. He just didn't have the drive or the spark of it. I keep coming back to the mental image of Walter White, because you want him to succeed. He's working so hard and he has his family's best interest at heart. But you see how he is almost always the architect of his own misery. Gygax had compared TSR to the lion and their competitors, jackals and vultures. But Arneson, sitting in TSR's own building with his lawyers during a stockholder meeting, was bearding the lion in its own den, while the lion should have been more worried about the tigers that had now arrived upon the scene. A year later, TSR decided it was time to cut its losses. They had lost wargaming allies over the past few years, including Heritage and, in the UK, Games Workshop. They could ill afford a lawsuit getting in the way with companies like 20th Century Fox and Mattel. It was naturally not everything that Arneson wanted, but it was a major paycheck that he could count on as well. And, after all the grandstanding, to admit his indispensable role in their flagship product. While some thought that this was the new war chest that Arneson would need to be able to better advance his own rival game company, it still floundered. Gygax wasn't a great businessman, but he was far and away a better one than Arneson was, although Arneson did indirectly make one contribution to the mainstream. He published a naval game, Larry Bond's Harpoon. And one customer bought that game and, to his amazement, discovered charts inside that were instrumental to an idea that he had been working on for a while, but gathering the kind of detailed information all in one place like this had seemed beyond his means. That man was Tom Clancy, and the result was the novel The Hunt for Red October. In fact, Clancy was so impressed that, after discussions with Larry Bond, Clancy's next book was about a full-on war against the Soviet Union called Red Storm Rising. In a final ironic twist, The Hunt for Red October would be turned into one of the all-time best-selling war board games in 1988, published by TSR. The settlement seemed to have spurred a second drought for Gygax, who took up his pen and wrote a piece called Who is Gary Gygax? It was essentially a way of exploring a man in the midst of an identity crisis, wondering what had happened to him since going from gamer to publisher, who he was, and what he should do now. It was a very human moment, and perhaps that was the reason that Gygax published it not in The Dragon, but in a magazine that got 1/10 of their audience, as if to get it on the record but not advertise the fact. But whatever this moment might have been, it did not dethrone TSR Gary and his ego. Not only was there no mention of Arneson in the piece, but he was also not mentioned in the next article about Gygax, which credits him fully with conceiving the core concepts of D&D on his own. It also rewrote history, saying that he bravely chose to quit his job to pursue a career making games. It did not state that he was fired for neglecting his work and appropriating office supplies for his gaming hobby. The truce with Arneson was well timed because it wasn't too much longer before Discover magazine did a piece on the game. While it was a reasonably balanced look, it did bring up both the Egbert disappearance and the Heber City banning. Again, two theories that are incompatible at the most basic logical level. Christian Life Ministries began sharing reasons why the game was incompatible with the Christian faith, such as the existence of pantheism in the game. John Terrell, an evangelist on the radio, railed against Halloween and that Sacramento was home to 1,000 witches. But he began preaching against the game too, which is how one listener learned about the problems with this game and knew that there was a scheduled event for 2 summer D&D sessions at the public park. Terrell fought against the events by arguing that D&D was a means of teaching witchcraft, and thus allowing it to be done in a public park was favoring a religion. In a 3-2 decision, the park board decided to cancel the event, though the tie-breaking vote was over the controversy rather than the seriousness of that argument, that if the game was likely to bring this kind of conflict, maybe it should be held in a private rather than public venue. This, naturally, was reported as another community that had banned D&D for its heretical content. One thing that had allowed the bitter pill of Arneson's settlement to go down easier was the freedom to explore new projects based on D&D. The movie naturally was the big one for Gygax, and a script was being considered by James Goldman. But Gygax made clear to all the games fans that this was not going to be some cheap use of their IP. He was going to make sure it was something on the level of Star Wars or Raiders of the Lost Ark. The fact that the game came up in the new #1 film of all time, E.T., had pleased them all greatly. Gygax's mind was opening to new possibilities that had less to do with either gaming or running the company, but in entertainment. Helping out with that would be the presence of a new face at the top of the company, Kevin Bloom, Brian's brother. Kevin started with 5 shares of TSR stock, but his father then transferred his shares to Kevin in order to incentivize him to help the company grow. The reason that stock options exist. Helping the company lines your own pocket. Although next time we'll see that get all out of control. Also starting to get out of control was the bad religious press regarding D&D. It was no longer fringe radio preachers who were speaking out against it, but more mainstream religious articles were identifying objectionable content such as demons. This prompted them to be severely diminished going forward. Magic the Gathering would face a similar issue and handle it the same way. The friction at home was growing. Gygax had already earned the ire of some members of the church with his smoking and drinking. The growing animosity over his satanic game led the family to finally cut their ties with the Jehovah's Witnesses. The stress at home reflected the stress the game itself was facing from this growing movement against it, and it's believed that this was the time that Gygax switched from smoking pot, which he had picked up after losing his insurance job, to using cocaine. After a teen committed suicide using his father's service revolver, a psychiatrist claimed that he had evidence that 60 suicides were directly connected to Dungeons & Dragons. You may be shocked to learn that this evidence was not shared with anyone else. TSR naturally had to leap on this. Crazed satanic panic stuff was one thing, but saying this game might drive your children to kill themselves was something they couldn't tolerate at all. So they made the point that if you compare the number of owners of D&D to the population at large, the suicide rate is pretty much consistent. In other words, there's no evidence that the game itself contributed to it. Dr. Joyce Brothers, for those of you not old enough to recognize the name, she was a psychologist who was a minor celebrity, appearing on The Tonight Show, game shows, and cameo in film and TV often. She had previously spoken about how role-playing was a good thing. So they hired Dr. Joyce Brothers to counter the negative mazes and monster-style attacks, saying that role-playing games are not only not harmful, it was actually a psychologically beneficial activity. Dr. Brothers also appeared at Gen Con to unveil a new TSR product aimed at children, but the time was overshadowed by a guest editorial written by Gygax that appeared in The Dragon. Early copies were available at the convention. In it, Gygax displayed his knack for being a sore winner. Gen Con was now bigger than Origins. SPI had been vanquished, Avalon Hill had been displaced by TSR as the #1 in the hobby, fantasy gaming had been vindicated. Gygax had every reason to feel that he had won, and every reason to gloat a little bit. But possibly because of paranoia caused by his cocaine use, it was no longer enough to win. He ranted that with only a few exceptions, the rest of the gaming hobby was united in their envy and hatred of TSR's success, and would do anything to stamp them out. That Gamma and the rest were using Origins to attempt to topple the tall bastion dedicated to fun that TSR was, and finished up by calling for a boycott of Origins. And his spleen not fully being vented yet, the next issue he railed against Rick Loomis, owner of Flying Buffalo and first president of Gamma, who had made a joking remark about TSR buying SPI to try to destroy Gamma. Who leads the adventure gaming industry? Who publishes cheap imitations of TSR games? Rick Loomis responded in his own newsletter, addressing all of Gygax's points, but most of all the salient question. Just because TSR is the largest, does that mean it's actually worthy of leading this industry? The treatment of Dave Arneson was the first hint of the tyrant that TSR Gary was. But it was now fully on display in print that Gygax did not want to lead the industry. He wanted to crush it under his heel until it would submit to his authority. Loomis's response included a reminder that this was just the latest of TSR Gary's unconscionable dictatorial attitude, comparing St. Andre and Arneson. The designer of Tunnels and Trolls is still a friend of mine, and he didn't have to sue me to collect his royalties. Loomis was immediately a folk hero in the gaming community for goading Gygax into finally publicly showing his true colors, his petty spitefulness. And TSR was left scrambling, trying to sort out the PR disaster of his public temper tantrum. That same year, the seed was planted for another blow against the game. Another teenage boy, Irving, committed suicide. Again, a tragedy, but unrelated to the game. But his mother, Patricia Pulling, wouldn't accept that her son would just kill himself. That awful game had to have driven him to this. He played D&D at school, and so she sued the principal of the school for $1 million for negligence, as he should have known after all those other publicized incidents that the game drives kids to kill themselves. Chicken John Rinaldi, after Gary Gygax's passing, would assert the exact opposite, that the game was there for kids like he had been to get through tough times, especially those who lack support from adults, or those who were being told by society that there was something wrong with them. Gary Gygax has saved more lives than penicillin, he said, with exaggeration. But it is certainly true that many who might likewise have ended their lives found ways to cope through role-playing. And that whatever sins TSR Gary was guilty of, we can't let that overshadow the joy and fulfillment that the game that Gygax co-created and made sure would survive the market brought into the world. Dave Arneson, for all of his skill as a designer, showed it takes more than that to succeed with a winning product. It is disappointing that a man who brought so much happiness would spend these years of his greatest success behaving so poorly that it would overshadow what he's accomplished. But Pulling wouldn't accept that her son's suicide had nothing to do with role-playing, and even after the lawsuit was tossed out, went on to sue TSR for $10 million, which was also tossed out. In imitation of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, she created BAD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, to attack the game. This effort would have languished in obscurity if not for the fact that it was brought to the attention of Pat Robertson. Robertson was a television preacher with such a powerful voice at the time that in 1988 he even ran as a nominee for President of the United States and carried 4 states during the primary. Well, Robertson was convinced that D&D was awful, and so he added his powerful voice in denouncing it. He didn't exactly go on a campaign against the game, and Robertson was hardly recognized by all Christians as being someone in the right. But nevertheless, his voice being added to it added further legitimacy to the argument that D&D was both harmful to children and anti-Christian. The misplaced grief of one mother had suddenly become part of the national conversation. But the fallout of that suicide was down the road. Right now, TSR was still trying to do damage control thanks to Gygax's editorials. For reasons we'll get into next time, SPI was absorbed into TSR, and the shambolic, irresponsible way that TSR had been involved in those events had led to a rumor that they had bought SPI and then destroyed it. This is what helped spark Gygax's outrage, that people would assume maliciousness when it was merely complete idiotic incompetence. Contrary to later assertions by Gygax that he was a helpless figurehead while the Blooms ran the company, he freely admitted that he was at the top, Brian was below him, and Kevin was below him, stuck with, quote, the dirty end of the stick. One example of that was him having to sort out this public fiasco. Kevin personally went to Origins in order to try to mend fences with Gamma. But this only prompted a conspiracy theory that TSR's new plan was to destroy the organization from the inside. Despite Gygax's later assertions that he was powerless, it was Kevin Bloom that was helpless in getting Gygax to recant. He would only eventually do so years down the line when he realized he'd made too many enemies to keep fighting on every front. And the problem didn't just lead to conflict with Gamma and Origins. Even inside the company, there were problems because of these editorials. The editor of Dragon quit in disgust, partially because he was tired of having to publish these insane editorials attacking Gamma. The other part, though, was due to the transparent, shameless management of the company that placed nepotism over the future of what they were trying to build. It's estimated that a minimum of 15 members of the Bloom extended family were part of the company. And unlike the days of, we need as much help as we can so family will pitch in, these were cases of cushy jobs they were typically unqualified for. One example was TSR's inexplicable purchase of Greenfield Needlewomen, a craft company that was in the red that just so happened to be owned by a member of the Bloom extended family. Another was of Kevin Bloom's sister, who was in a VP position that she was not qualified to hold. Someone in such a role should at least have a bachelor's degree, he was informed. So it was agreed that his sister would go to college, TSR would pay for it, and since she would be studying rather than coming to work, would receive a stipend from TSR to maintain her lifestyle. But even that didn't hold a candle to the problems that Mike Carr was dealing with. He was stuck between Kevin Bloom and Kevin Bloom's brother-in-law, Jack Sloan. This uncomfortable situation was made worse by the fact that Sloan was the poster child for nepotism, grossly underqualified for his job, and acted like someone who knew that he could not be fired. Carr religiously documented everything just to cover his own ass, but there was nothing he could do about conversations that would take place between Kevin and Sloan, given their personal relationship with each other. Problems came related to the Dungeon board game with the inclusion of Dragon Dice, something Brian Bloom had ordered that was simultaneously more expensive than regular dice, but looked cheaper than regular dice. They had to come with a crayon that you used to fill in the indentations yourself because the numbers were invisible otherwise. But the biggest problem they had to deal with was a game called Fantasy Forest that was marketed for children. It was related to the way that the board was folded. The company that was supposed to manufacture the board didn't get the right figures in order to make it fold properly. When the boards finally came back in, it turned out they wouldn't fit in the box. Sloan, as was typical, was not in the office that day. He was frequently out golfing rather than being at his place of employment, even during the winter months. For anyone tempted to say that Gygax was trying to bring professionalism to TSR when he installed a time clock and made Dave Arneson use it, it's a bit difficult to square that with an executive simply not showing up for work because he felt like going Florida to golf that day. This time, he wasn't on the golf course. He was at a baseball game and had to be paged in order to deal with a crisis in his own department. The mistake cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that, combined with Mike Carr's careful catalog of his shameful mismanagement and a thorough review of his mistakes, the conclusion was obvious. He gets to keep his job. Outraged, 2 anonymous members of the purchasing department finally sent a letter stating that the current situation was untenable, that they would give 110% to this company under competent management, but were unable to function in this current environment. It soon came to light that Sloan, along with his father and Mary Bloom, had come in on a Saturday thinking no one was there to see them and was doing something in the office, the scuttlebutt being probably to alter records. Gygax's involvement after this revelation was a company-wide instruction to include him in such matters, but Jack Sloan was still kept on in his position. Mike Carr transferred to a different department to avoid being involved in any more of the messes that this absurd situation created. Gygax tolerated this for 2 reasons. One, he had a lot of his own immediate family working for TSR himself, including advertisement through a company that was wholly owned by Mary Jo. And also because, despite the myriad screw-ups, it was rarely worthy of his attention, he felt. In fact, at one point, Kevin Bloom sent a memo to himself, from himself, to remind himself to follow the chain of command at TSR, a not-so-subtle way of telling everyone in the company not to try going over his head to Gygax. There was no real incentive to worry about this because the trio had convinced themselves that the game would continue to grow and grow. D&D was the tabletop game of the moment, and no other game could possibly challenge them. Except a game came to challenge them. Out of the north, called Trivial Pursuit. It proceeded to fly off the shelves at a rate that TSR could only envy. In the midst of flying high, the company suffered a sudden devastating blow for which TSR Gary could find only one silver lining. Trivial Pursuit had a sports and leisure question that asked, who created Dungeons and Dragons? The answer on the back, Gary Gygax.